morning. We're going to talk about pre-Darwin history today. That is like the kind of things that were sort of being talked about before Darwin came up with this idea of natural selection. So these are just some of the people. You can go ahead and take notes on this. We're going to talk about each one individually. But starting a long time ago with Aristotle, he came up with a concept called scala naturae. And what that was scale of nature, where he was like the first one to really think about the relationship of different kinds of organisms to each other. And he was saying there's like this scale where the worms were, he said worms because he didn't know about microorganisms, were at the bottom, and that man or woman was at the top, and that there was like rungs on this ladder, and that organisms strived upwards. Like that was kind of his idea, that organisms were on different rungs and they were different levels of complexity. That scale of nature idea was a common sort of thread to thought, even with some people still today, but that was a common thread for a long time. Another person was Linnaeus. You probably have seen a little L. If you've ever seen a scientific name, genus and species, there's oftentimes a little L after that, and what that is standing for is him. And he came up with the first taxonomic classification system, which we actually still use today. And the basic idea was the groups were based on mainly body form, sometimes on use of something like, say, for example, wings or something like that. He classified many organisms. He ended up having a couple of groups in North Carolina and Virginia, where things were sent after things were in the United States. And this classification system was really useful in the sense that it goes like this: the kingdom. He had kingdom. Of course, now we have another one that's on top of that called domain, but it's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, in a hierarchy. The way to remember that is King Philip came over for good sex or a green salad, right? So anyway, and of course now domain is on the top, so they made a different group. And that's kind of the unique thing about this, is that you can add groups to this. In other words, here, like this, if these were the top 3 groups, of course he had 5 kingdoms, but if there were 5 groups there, you could add to that at any given time, add another group, or take a group that is from the lower level and put it up there without disrupting the whole rest of the classification system. So that's what's been really nice and useful about that taxonomy. And we still use this taxonomic system. So that was back in the 1700s. Another person was Cuvier. Cuvier was, Smith. I skipped him. Smith was a cartographer. That's like a map maker. And what he was actually a surveyor in England, and he went around and surveyed different pieces of land. This is when England didn't used to be divided into land holdings, and then it was, and he was surveying land, and he came up with this. He noticed strata in rocks, that is layers in the rocks, and he actually looked at some of the things in those layers, and he noticed that there were primitive organisms in the bottom layers, meaning that there were organisms that he didn't recognize and that seemed to be simpler than the current day organisms. So he came up with this idea of strata. Later he noticed that those strata in the rocks in England were the same as the strata in the rocks across the channel in France. So that sort of gave him, this idea of layers of rocks that maybe have been, broken up or something like that. So he was one of the first people to actually think about that, but he wasn't a very well-spoken person. He's kind of a shy guy, and so his ideas didn't really take much weight, I guess, in the public eye, so to speak. Then along came this guy Cuvier. He was a guy. He was actually one of the first paleontologists. He was the dinosaur guy. He's first discovered dinosaur bones and rearticulated them, which means that he put them together in their like wired them together so that it made the organism look like what it might have looked like in real life. And he also was kind of an artist. Like he put them together and then imagined, but based on like muscle attachments and stuff like that, where the muscles would have been, and kind of built dinosaurs. But he came up with this idea of catastrophes because dinosaurs, of course, did not exist anymore. And he was saying that there had to be something that wiped them completely out and that new organisms arose. And so he was one of the first people to come up with the idea that there have been times in the past where organisms have declined and new organisms have evolved. That is, new species and new groups coming out of something that wasn't currently present. All right, so that was like the first idea of evolutionary thought. And around that same time as all these other people, it was a guy named Hutton. He was a geologist, and it was actually the geologists, with people like Smith and Cuvier, that really brought about the thinking of evolution. And what Hutton thought, he came up with this concept called gradualism, later known as a theory called uniformitarianism, where he was saying that the Earth was much older than the 6,000 years that was the oldest that anybody was saying at the time, and that there was slow, gradual change in the Earth's crust, that things, have been changing and sort of slowly over time, so that you get different things, and it kind of went with the strata idea. You get different things at different time periods, and that things, evolve. And this was very heretical. That is, people, really didn't take it in or believe it too much at the time. But later on, he was, known to be one of the first people to come up with that concept.